The flight from New York to Los Angeles began like any other. The cabin was filled with the low hum of conversation as passengers settled into their seats. Some flicked through magazines, while others stared out the windows watching the city shrink beneath them. Emma, the lead flight attendant, walked down the aisles with a practiced smile, greeting each passenger. As she passed, her movements were fluid and calm, but there was something in the air that felt off. The weather was clear, and the plane was cruising smoothly, but a sense of unease tugged at her chest, an invisible weight that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the first time she had flown, and she knew how to read the atmosphere, but this felt different. Emma tried to push the feeling aside as she continued her duties, offering drinks and checking seatbelts as the flight attendants always did, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She paused for a moment at the back of the cabin to glance out of the small service window, her eyes scanning the endless stretch of sky. But all she saw was a blanket of clouds forming in the distance. She couldn't tell if it was the light or something else, but the clouds looked strange, darker than usual. Emma shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought it was just her imagination after all, but the unease lingered. Emma felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to find one of the younger passengers, a man in his 30s, looking a bit pale. "Excuse me, miss, I don't want to cause trouble, but are we flying a bit lower than usual?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Emma gave him a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, sir. We're cruising at the normal altitude, but thank you for your concern," she responded, her voice steady, despite the slight knot in her stomach. But the man wasn't convinced. He stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly, his eyes still uneasy as he returned to his seat. Emma couldn't help but notice that the few people around him seemed just as tense. There was something about the atmosphere today that made the entire cabin feel charged. Even though there was no apparent reason for alarm, Emma moved on with her duties, but her mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling. She couldn't quite place it. Felt like something was about to happen, something big, and it wasn't just her imagination. She could feel the tension building inside her like the air just before a storm. The unease grew with each passing minute. She couldn't ignore it anymore. As she moved down the aisle, her eyes flicked over to a middle-aged couple sitting quietly by the window, their faces calm, but their hands were gripping the armrests tightly. Emma's gaze lingered on them for a moment, and she noticed the slight trembling of their fingers. It was as if they could feel it too, the change in the air, the subtle shift that no one could explain. Then the plane shook. The sudden jolt made Emma stumble, and her heart leaped into her throat. She managed to catch herself, but before she could take a breath, the turbulence hit again, this time much worse. The entire cabin rattled, and the lights flickered overhead. The passengers gasped, their seatbelts tightened, and a young woman nearby shrieked in panic. Emma's calm exterior faltered only for a second, but in that moment she knew something was wrong, very wrong. The flight attendants were trained to handle turbulence, but this was different. It wasn't just the plane moving erratically. It was the feeling in the air that something far worse was happening outside the windows. The sky had turned an ominous shade of gray, and the plane bucked again with terrifying force. Emma's stomach lurched as the fear spread across the cabin. She moved swiftly to the intercom, trying to maintain her composure, but her voice quivered when she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are experiencing some turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and stay seated. We will keep you updated." Her words echoed through the cabin, but the silence that followed was heavy with anxiety. Emma's hands shook as she grasped the armrest of a nearby seat. The fear was spreading through the cabin like wildfire, but she couldn't show it, not yet, not until she knew exactly what was happening. She glanced at the cockpit door, but before she could act, the plane jolted again, this time a sickening lurch that seemed to tear through the entire fuselage. The screams from the passengers grew louder now. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The unease inside her had turned into full-blown panic. The plane was losing altitude, and fast. Something had gone terribly wrong, and Emma could only pray they were still high enough to survive whatever was coming next. The turbulence didn't stop. It seemed to worsen with each passing second. The plane shuddered violently again, and this time Emma could hear the distinct groan of metal, as if the very structure of the aircraft was protesting the strain. She gripped the aisle and forced herself to remain calm, But every instinct screamed that they were in danger. She could feel the fear spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Passengers were whispering frantic prayers. Some were crying, others were gripping the armrests so tightly their knuckles turned white. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest, but she couldn't afford to panic, not with all these people depending on her. She hurried down the aisle again, checking on the elderly couple she had passed earlier. The man's face was pale, and his wife was clutching his hand tightly. She leaned in closer, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. "We're going to be all right," she told them, though she didn't believe it herself. The woman nodded, but her eyes were wide with fear. Emma could see it in their faces, the same fear that was creeping up on her too. As she moved toward the front of the cabin, she noticed the young man from earlier who had questioned her about the altitude. He was clutching his seatbelt now, his eyes locked on the flight attendants at the front of the plane, watching their every move. It was clear he was scared, but trying to hold it together. Emma felt a pang of sympathy for him. He wasn't the only one terrified. She tried to offer him a reassuring smile, but she could see that it didn't help at all. She could hear the muffled sound of the captain's voice through the intercom, but it was barely audible over the sound of the engines sputtering in the background. "This is the captain. We are experiencing a malfunction in the engines. We are losing altitude. Please remain calm. We are trying to stabilize the situation." His voice was calm, but the crack in it was unmistakable. Emma's stomach dropped. She had never heard the captain sound like that. The thought that they might not make it to the ground started to settle in her mind. The fear that had been lingering in the back of her mind was becoming a harsh reality. She swallowed hard and tried to push it away. She had to keep it together for the passengers, for the crew, for herself. She glanced over her shoulder and saw a flash of movement near the window, a familiar face that seemed out of place in the chaos. It was Keanu Reeves, sitting there looking completely at ease, as if the whole world had fallen apart around him, and he was the only one untouched by the madness. Emma blinked once, then twice. Was she imagining things? Keanu Reeves, the famous actor, wasn't he supposed to be on a private flight? She quickly dismissed the thought and focused on her job, but the sight of him only added to the strange feeling in her chest. Something about his presence felt almost surreal. She turned her attention back to the aisle, but couldn't help stealing another glance at him. Keanu was still sitting there, calm as ever, staring out the window, watching the storm outside the plane with a quiet intensity that unsettled her even more. How could he be so calm in the face of all this chaos? It didn't make sense. Emma's thoughts were racing, and she couldn't focus. The plane bucked again, and this time it was worse than before. The entire cabin seemed to tilt sideways, and the oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The screams from the passengers filled the air as people fumbled to put on their masks. Emma's mind raced. She needed to think quickly. There was no time to waste. She moved quickly down the aisle again, trying to get everyone to stay calm and secure their masks. But her own hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold her own mask. She felt a lump form in her throat. This was real. They were in serious trouble. She had never felt this powerless before. Her body was shaking with fear, but she refused to show it. She had to be strong for them. She had to keep them together. She felt another sudden jolt, and this time it felt like the plane was falling faster than ever. The floor seemed to tilt again, and Emma stumbled against the seats, but she caught herself. Her heart raced faster now, and the voices in her head screamed at her to do something, anything, but she didn't know what to do. She looked down the aisle again toward the cockpit, where the crew was working frantically trying to figure out what was happening, but they were struggling. The captain was now speaking again, but the words were barely more than a whisper. "We may not make it to the airport. We may have to land on a different strip. Please stay calm." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Emma's thoughts were spinning, and it felt like the world was closing in on her as the plane shook again, and she realized they might not make it out of this. She glanced once more at Keanu, his face still calm as ever, and for some reason in that moment, she knew she had to speak to him. She had to ask for help. The plane shook again, and Emma's heart nearly stopped. She staggered for a moment, and then grabbed onto the back of a seat, her breath coming in short gasps. She looked around the cabin. Panic was spreading like wildfire. Now the passengers were no longer trying to hold it together. They were screaming, they were crying, some were praying, others were frantically trying to call loved ones on their phones. But the signal was lost. The air felt thick with fear and uncertainty. The oxygen masks hung like a reminder of the danger that was closing in on them. Emma's legs felt weak as she took a step forward toward the front of the plane. Her hands were trembling so much she could barely grip the armrests. As she moved past the rows of seats, she kept her eyes focused on the aisle, trying to avoid making eye contact with the terrified passengers. She had to remain strong for them, but it was getting harder and harder to do so. The plane jerked again, and the force nearly knocked her off balance. She quickly grabbed hold of the seat back and steadied herself. Her mind raced. She couldn't remember the last time she felt so helpless. The cockpit door was just ahead, and Emma knew she needed to get there. She had to talk to the captain, figure out what was going on. But something inside her told her the situation was much worse than they were letting on. The door to the cockpit was ajar, and she could hear muffled voices inside. The tension in the air was thick. She pushed the door open and stepped inside the small space. She was met with the sight of the captain frantically working the controls, his face pale, his hands shaking as he tried to steady the plane. Captain, Emma's voice broke through the chaos. He didn't respond at first, but then he looked up, his eyes wide with panic. "We're losing altitude fast. The engine's not responding. I don't know if we can make it to the nearest airport." He said. The words came out in a rush, and Emma's blood ran cold. Her chest tightened at the realization they were running out of options. The captain's hands trembled as he continued working the controls, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't stabilize it. We might have to ditch the plane somewhere in the wilderness." The words echoed in Emma's mind like a nightmare made real. She didn't know how much longer they could keep this up. She had to act fast. But what could she do? There was nothing she could do, nothing at all but wait and pray. The fear was overwhelming. But she knew she had to keep her composure. She had to be the one to hold it together for the sake of the passengers. She turned toward the cockpit door, about to leave, when a voice caught her attention. "Emma." She froze. The voice was calm, steady, but it was a voice that didn't belong on this plane. Keanu Reeves was standing there in the doorway, his eyes locked on hers, his expression unreadable. Emma blinked once, then twice, as if she was seeing things, but when she looked again, he was still there, standing in the doorway of the cockpit, as if he belonged. Emma's mind spun for a moment. She couldn't understand what he was doing here, how he could possibly be so calm in a situation like this. But something about him made her feel as if there was hope. She took a step forward, trying to focus her thoughts. "Keanu, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaky. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked past her into the cockpit, his movements smooth and deliberate. Emma could feel her pulse racing. She had no idea what to think, what to believe, but something told her that Keanu wasn't just another celebrity stuck in this disaster. Something told her he knew exactly what to do. "I've trained for situations like this," he said, his voice low and reassuring. Emma watched in stunned silence as he moved toward the captain, who was still struggling to keep control of the plane. Keanu's hands were steady as he looked over the captain's shoulder and began speaking in calm, measured tones, giving him instructions. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing as she processed what was happening. Keanu Reeves wasn't just a passenger on this flight. He was taking control. The plane jerked again, this time harder than ever. Emma's stomach lurched, and she grabbed onto the seat next to her. But Keanu didn't flinch. He was completely unfazed. His voice remained steady as he issued calm orders to the captain and the crew. His presence was magnetic. He radiated an unshakable calm that seemed to settle the frantic energy around them. For a moment, it felt like the air itself had quieted. The chaos of the plane and the terror of the passengers faded into the background as Keanu focused on the task at hand. Emma had no idea how he knew what to do or how he could be so composed, but in that moment she knew they needed him more than ever. He was their only chance. Keanu moved swiftly and with purpose. His calmness was almost unnerving in the midst of the chaos. The captain seemed to be growing more desperate as he fumbled with the controls. His face was drenched in sweat, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Keanu stepped closer, his eyes scanning the instruments, his hands steady as he adjusted the autopilot. He spoke quietly but firmly to the captain. "Let me take over for a moment. Focus on the cabin and make sure the passengers stay calm." The captain hesitated for a second, then nodded reluctantly. Keanu slid into the captain's seat without hesitation. His hands gripped the controls with a quiet confidence that sent a shiver down Emma's spine. She had never seen someone so composed under pressure. It was like he had done this 1,000 times before. Emma's heart was still pounding as she watched him work. Her mind was racing. How was he so sure? How could he know what to do? She had only seen Keanu in movies, never in a life-or-death situation like this. But there was something about him that made her believe he could do it. She had to trust him. She had no choice but to trust him. The plane bucked violently again, this time sending Emma tumbling forward. She caught herself against the wall, her breath catching in her throat. Her body screamed with adrenaline. But when she looked up, Keanu didn't flinch. He was calm, focused, like a man who had faced down impossible odds before. The captain was speaking frantically to the crew over the intercom, his voice cracking. "We need to brace for a possible emergency landing. We may not make it to an airport. We have to find an open space to land." The passengers were screaming now, their panic reaching a fever pitch. Emma's mind was spinning, but she forced herself to focus. Keanu was still in control. He hadn't broken a sweat, even as the plane shook again, and the fear among the passengers grew more intense. She could hear a woman crying near the back, and a child's frightened voice asking if they were going to die. Emma felt a pit form in her stomach, but she forced herself to push it away. She had to help the crew. She had to be the calm voice in the storm. Keanu's voice broke through the panic. "Emma," he called without looking up from the controls, "I need you to go to the back of the plane and help calm the passengers. Talk to them. Keep them focused and secure. I'll guide you through the landing." She nodded without thinking. Her legs felt shaky as she turned and made her way down the aisle. She couldn't stop her hands from trembling. She couldn't stop the fear from clawing at her insides. But she couldn't show it, not now. She had to be strong for them, for everyone on board. As she reached the back of the plane, she saw the full extent of the panic. There were passengers standing in the aisles, gripping their seats. Some were crying, others were frozen with fear. She walked slowly down the aisle, her voice steady. As she spoke, "Everyone, please remain calm. We are going to get through this. We are working on a safe landing. Please put on your oxygen masks and fasten your seatbelts." She repeated the words over and over as she moved through the cabin, trying to keep people calm, trying to make them believe that everything was going to be okay. But it was getting harder and harder to convince them when every jolt of the plane sent them screaming in terror. She could feel the weight of their fear pressing on her shoulders, and for a moment she wanted to give in. She wanted to break down and scream too, but she couldn't, not yet, not until they were on the ground safely. She had a job to do. She had to keep them alive. She had to keep them calm. She finally reached the back where the elderly couple she had seen earlier was sitting. The man was clutching his wife's hands so tightly his knuckles were white, his eyes were wide with terror. But when he saw Emma, he let out a shaky breath and managed a small smile. "We're scared," he said, his voice breaking. Emma leaned in close and spoke softly. "I know it's scary, but we're going to get through this, I promise." She could see the doubt in his eyes, but she couldn't let him see hers. The plane jolted again, but this time it felt different. It felt like the final descent. Emma's stomach lurched, and she had to force herself to stay on her feet. The plane was losing altitude faster now, and they were running out of time. Keanu's calm voice echoed through the intercom. "Braced for impact. We are preparing for an emergency landing. I need everyone to stay in their seats and stay calm. We are almost there." Emma's heart was racing, but she took a deep breath and looked at the passengers around her. They were looking to her for strength, and she couldn't let them down. Not now, not when they were so close. She steadied herself and whispered, "We're going to make it," even if she didn't believe it herself. The plane descended rapidly now, every lurch of the aircraft sending a wave of panic through the passengers. Screams and sobs echoed from all corners of the cabin. The smell of fear was thick in the air. Emma gripped the seat in front of her, her knuckles turning white. As she tried to steady herself, the turbulence was relentless, and the noise of the engine sputtering was enough to rattle her to her core. She couldn't remember the last time she felt so terrified. The ground was coming closer too quickly. The horizon outside the window was blurred by the rain and the darkening clouds, but in the cockpit Keanu's voice was steady and commanding. "We are almost there, Emma. Keep the passengers calm. We're in the final stages of the descent." Emma didn't respond, but nodded to herself. She could feel the eyes of every passenger on her. As she made her way back toward the front, her legs felt like lead with every step. But she pushed through. She had to. She couldn't let them see her fear. She arrived at the front of the cabin and took a deep breath, her eyes darting around at the frightened faces of the people she was supposed to protect. They were all holding onto their seatbelts, some praying, others shaking in their seats, but none of them were looking at the bright sky outside. All they saw was the chaos of the plane shaking violently around them. Emma's breath caught when she looked down at her own hand. It was trembling uncontrollably. Her mind raced, trying to form a plan, but there was no plan left. The descent was too fast, too steep. The plane was descending at a rate that would have been impossible to control if not for Keanu. She looked back at the cockpit and saw him there, still calm, still focused, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. She couldn't understand it. How could he be so unfazed when everything around them was falling apart? How did he know what to do? Keanu had taken control, but he was still directing the plane through the storm of fear and chaos. Emma felt a deep sense of gratitude, mixed with awe. She could hear the captain's voice crack over the intercom. "We're coming in too fast. We may have to ditch." His voice barely audible over the noise of the plane shaking again. Keanu's voice cut through the panic like a sharp knife. "Brace for impact now." He said the words were simple, but there was an undeniable authority in his tone. Emma turned to the passengers again, her voice firm, but calming. "Everyone, please brace for impact. This is going to be rough, but we will land safely. Keep your heads down and stay in your seats." She could feel the fear in the air now. It was a tangible thing pressing in on all sides. The passengers were no longer listening to her. Their eyes were wide with terror, their breath coming in shallow gasps. Emma felt the weight of it all. The pressure was overwhelming, but she couldn't let go. She couldn't break now, not when they were so close to the ground. And then, without warning, the plane dropped sharply. Everything around her seemed to disappear for a moment as the sudden descent took her breath away. She could hear the screaming of the passengers, now the sound almost deafening as the plane shook violently again. Emma's heart was in her throat. She tried to keep her feet steady, but the plane lurched one more time, and she was thrown against the wall. The lights flickered overhead, and for a moment she couldn't see anything but darkness. Her mind screamed at her to get up to help the passengers, but everything was spinning. She forced herself to focus. She had to get back to the front, but it felt like the ground was coming at them too fast. She looked toward the cockpit and saw Keanu's face for the first time in what felt like an eternity. His eyes were locked on the controls, but there was something different in them, something that made her realize they were nearing the end, the moment when they would either make it or crash. She couldn't look away from him now, even in the chaos. There was a stillness in his eyes that made her feel as if somehow they were going to survive. But she didn't know how. She didn't know if they were going to land safely or if they were going to crash. But as the plane dropped again, the loud crash of the wheels hitting the ground shook her to her core. The plane bounced once, twice, and then it began to slide. The terrifying screech of metal against asphalt filled the air as the plane skidded out of control. Emma's heart raced as the entire plane jolted in every direction. The noise of the landing gear scraping against the tarmac was deafening. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her mind was consumed with the chaos of the moment, everything happening too fast, too violently to process. And then the plane came to a stop with a jarring final thud. The screeching of the wheels died down, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Emma could hardly breathe. Her heart was pounding in her chest. The smell of burning rubber and smoke filled the cabin. But she didn't care. They had landed. They were alive. Her body felt like it was made of stone. She could barely move, but somehow she forced herself to stand. The silence was heavy, and it felt like 1,000 years had passed in those few seconds. The cabin was still, and then slowly the sound of the passengers began to break through the quiet. There were cries of relief, tears of joy and disbelief, as everyone realized they had survived. The silence that followed the landing was almost unbearable. The plane had come to a stop. but the tension in the air remained thick like a fog that wouldn't lift. Emma's heart was still racing. Her legs felt like jelly as she slowly made her way down the aisle to the back of the plane. The passengers were slowly starting to stir. Some were crying, others were whispering in disbelief, still too stunned to process what had just happened. Emma's mind was spinning. She couldn't believe they had actually made it. They had landed against all odds. But the relief was short-lived. As she glanced toward the cockpit, the door was ajar, and she could see Keanu still sitting there, his hands gripping the controls, his expression calm. But there was something in his eyes, something that told her the danger wasn't over. Not yet. Emma hesitated for a moment, but then forced herself to approach him. She needed to know what was going on. She needed answers. "Keanu," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers. "You did it," she whispered. "We landed." His gaze never wavered, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes, a realization that she wasn't prepared for. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice low and measured. Emma's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean by that? "The plane is damaged beyond repair. The systems are fried, and we're on a runway that's barely long enough to stop us. If anything else goes wrong, we're stuck here." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. She had thought they were safe, that they had escaped, but it wasn't over. They were still in danger. She glanced out the cockpit window and saw the vast expanse of open land surrounding them. There were no emergency vehicles in sight, no sign of help anywhere in the distance. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her once more. She had been so focused on the immediate crisis that she hadn't considered what would happen after the landing. Now that they had stopped, they were sitting ducks in the middle of nowhere. "How long do we have?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. Keanu didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat back in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the instruments again. "The next few minutes are crucial. We need to get the passengers off the plane quickly. The longer we stay here, the more exposed we are," he said. Emma's pulse quickened as she processed the gravity of the situation. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no immediate help, and no way of knowing if anyone would be able to reach them before it was too late. She turned and looked at the passengers, still disoriented and confused. Many of them were standing now. Some had begun to leave their seats and were gathering their things. Emma quickly stepped forward. "Everyone, listen to me," she shouted, her voice cutting through the murmurs of panic. "We need to stay calm and get off the plane as quickly as possible. I need everyone to move toward the exits in an orderly fashion. Do not stop, do not look back, just move." The passengers looked at her with a mix of fear and confusion, but they listened for the most part. Slowly and shakily, they began to gather their things and make their way toward the exits. Emma moved to the front to check on the emergency exits, making sure everything was in place. As she moved, she could feel the panic starting to rise again in the air. It was impossible to ignore the uncertainty and fear that hung over them like a storm cloud. She checked the exits again, and then the stairs. She had to keep it together. She had to get them off the plane. But before she could say anything more, Keanu's voice cut through the noise. "Emma, we have to move now," he said, his tone urgent. Emma turned toward him to find him standing in the doorway of the cockpit. His face was set in a hard expression, his eyes locked on her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaky. "We're not alone," he said, his words sending a cold shock through her body. She froze for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What do you mean?" she asked, her heart pounding now. Keanu's eyes never left hers, and the tension in the air seemed to grow heavier by the second. "There are people out there watching us, and we don't have much time to figure out who they are or what they want." His words hung in the air like a deadly warning. Emma's mind raced. What was he talking about? She glanced out the window again, but saw nothing, only the empty landscape stretching out before them. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them," Keanu said, his voice low and steady. "I saw them watching us from the trees when we landed. We need to get moving now, or we're going to be in more danger than we can handle." Emma's heart skipped a beat as she realized the true extent of the danger they were in. They weren't safe. Not at all. They were stranded with a ticking clock and unknown threats closing in. The air was thick with tension. Emma's mind raced as she tried to process what Keanu had said. There were people out there watching them, And they weren't alone. She glanced out the window once more, but saw nothing. The landscape seemed eerily still, the wind barely stirring the tall grass outside. But her gut told her something was wrong. The panic from the passengers was beginning to rise again. Some were now looking at the exits with hesitation. Others were whispering among themselves. Emma took a deep breath. Her eyes met Keanu's. His expression was one of calm determination, but there was something in his gaze, something that told her they were running out of time. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady, but her insides were anything but calm. Keanu looked out the cockpit window for a moment, his brow furrowing, as if he was calculating their next move. "We need to move fast," he said, his voice low and serious. "If they know we're stranded, they'll try to take advantage of it. We can't let them get close." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she processed his words. What kind of danger were they really facing? Were they being watched by hostile forces, or something worse? Her thoughts raced, but she couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now, not when everything depended on them staying calm and acting quickly. She turned back to the passengers and shouted, "Everyone get off the plane now. I need everyone to move quickly but remain calm. We're not alone, and we have to get out of here." The panic among the passengers was palpable as the reality of their situation started to set in. People began to move more quickly now, gathering their things and heading for the exits. Emma glanced back toward Keanu. He was still standing in the cockpit doorway, his eyes scanning the horizon, his body tense with alertness. He was right, they weren't alone, and the feeling of being watched sent a chill down her spine. The passengers were now outside the plane, many of them looking around in confusion and fear. Emma hurried to join them, trying to keep them moving in the right direction. "This way," she urged as she guided them toward the edge of the runway. She looked back toward the plane and saw the final few passengers still disembarking. Her eyes darted around the area again. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was too still, too quiet. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. She stopped for a moment and listened, her heart racing in the silence. It felt as though the very earth beneath her feet was about to shift. She heard it then, a faint sound in the distance, the crackle of a branch snapping, followed by another soft rustling of leaves. Emma's pulse quickened. She turned to Keanu, who had also heard it. His eyes narrowed. "They're getting closer," he said, his voice low and tense. Without saying another word, he began to move toward the trees where the sound had come from. Emma felt a surge of fear, but she knew she couldn't stay behind. She followed him quickly, keeping low and moving carefully toward the trees, her eyes scanning every shadow. As they approached, they were getting closer now. They had no time to waste. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as they neared the tree line. Keanu moved with the precision of someone who had been in situations like this before, his every movement calculated and deliberate. Emma struggled to keep up with him as he slid through the dense underbrush. She could hear the sounds of footsteps, now faint but unmistakable. Someone was out there. Someone was closing in. Her stomach churned with dread. Keanu stopped abruptly in front of her, holding a hand up, signaling her to freeze. She did instantly. Her heart was pounding in her ears. The footsteps were growing louder now, and she could hear the sound of breathing. Too close, too close. Emma's eyes darted around, desperately looking for some form of cover, but there was nothing nearby. The trees were sparse, and the tall grass offered little concealment. Keanu gestured silently for her to crouch down behind a small thicket. They both dropped to the ground and huddled low to the earth. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to steady herself. They were so close now. The sounds of footsteps were unmistakable. Someone was walking directly toward them. Her mind raced with possibilities. Who could it be? Were they hostile, or simply curious? Was there a rescue team coming to find them? Or were they alone and vulnerable? Keanu held his breath and motioned for Emma to do the same. He raised his head slightly to peer through the grass, his eyes scanning the area ahead of them. He nodded slightly, and for a brief moment, Emma thought they might be safe. But then a voice broke through the silence, a voice that made her blood run cold. "They're out there, I can see them." The voice was low but distinct, and it sent a wave of fear through Emma's body. Who were they? How many of them were out there? Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. She felt trapped, helpless. As the footsteps came closer, still the voice called out again, "We need to move fast. We've got them in sight. They won't get far." Emma's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she realized the danger was far worse than she'd ever imagined. They weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. Emma's breath hitched in her throat, her mind racing with terror. She tried to steady herself, but the words echoed in her head. They were being hunted. Her heart thudded against her chest, like a drumbeat too loud, too fast. She could hear the footsteps now, unmistakable and steady, the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. They were getting closer. Emma's eyes flicked to Keanu. He was crouched low beside her, his face set in grim determination. He motioned for her to stay still and quiet. He was listening. The footsteps had stopped, but they weren't alone. Keanu slowly leaned forward, inching his head above the thicket, his sharp eyes scanning the area ahead. Emma couldn't move. All she could do was hold her breath, her body frozen in place, as if any sudden movement would betray their position. Keanu's hand tightened around hers. He pulled her gently to the side, gesturing silently for her to follow him. They crawled slowly through the underbrush, moving as silently as possible, their eyes constantly darting to the trees around them. Emma's every nerve was on edge, her senses heightened. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the grass sent a jolt of fear through her veins. They had to move quickly, but without making a sound. Keanu's movements were swift and sure. They reached a clearing ahead, and he motioned for Emma to stop. She held her breath as she crouched low in the tall grass, her heart thundering in her ears. But just as she thought they were safe, she saw them, figures moving through the tree shadows that seemed to blend with the night. They were wearing dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks and hoods. They moved with precision and purpose. Emma's stomach lurched as she realized they were no ordinary scavengers. They were professionals, whatever they were here for. It wasn't good. They were trained. She could see that in their every movement. Keanu's hand gripped her arm, his eyes never leaving the approaching figures. He looked back toward the plain, and then to Emma. His voice was barely a whisper. "We can't stay here much longer. We need to get back to the others." Emma nodded, even though her stomach was in knots. She wanted to run, but she knew it wouldn't work. They were outnumbered and outgunned. If these people had weapons, they were in deep trouble. Keanu's eyes flicked to the sky for a moment, as if calculating their options. But there was no escape, not like this, not without help. Emma's thoughts raced. She thought about the passengers who were still by the plane. She thought about how vulnerable they were, how close the enemy was, and she realized they had to make a choice. They had to act now, or they wouldn't get out of this alive. Keanu suddenly grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a small outcrop of rocks nearby. They ducked behind it and waited silently, listening. The voices of the figures came closer now, and Emma could hear them clearly. "They're out here somewhere. Keep looking. They can't have gone far." One of the men said, his voice low but cold. "Find them before they get back to the plane." Emma's blood ran cold at the words. They were looking for them. Specifically, Keanu turned to Emma, his eyes locked on hers. "We don't have much time," he said. "I need you to trust me." His words hit her like a hammer, and without thinking, she nodded. She had to trust him. She had no other choice. He slowly pulled a small device from his jacket pocket. It looked like a communication radio. He held it close to his mouth and whispered something into it. She couldn't hear the words, but his tone was urgent. A response came back, crackling through the static. Keanu listened carefully, his jaw tightening, before he tucked the radio back into his jacket. Emma didn't ask what he had heard. She didn't want to know. All she knew was that time was running out. They couldn't stay hidden behind the rocks forever. Keanu stood slowly and motioned for Emma to follow him again. They moved cautiously toward the plane, their bodies low, and every step measured. The enemy was close now, too close. Emma could hear their voices more clearly, their footsteps crunching in the underbrush. They were right behind them. Keanu grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her into the trees just as the figures came into view, their faces now clear in the pale moonlight. Emma's breath caught in her throat. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in black. Their movements were precise and practiced. They were a team trained to hunt, and it was obvious they had been tracking them since they landed. Keanu didn't hesitate. He pulled Emma further into the trees. Just as one of the men turned and caught a glimpse of movement, he shouted something to the others, and Emma's heart froze. They were spotted. Keanu's hand tightened on her wrist, and he pulled her faster. "Keep moving, don't look back," he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. Emma's mind screamed for her to run, But her legs felt like they were made of lead as they sprinted through the trees, her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She heard the sounds of footsteps behind them. Getting closer, she could feel the heat of pursuit pressing in on her. The noise grew louder and louder, the sound of their enemies. Closing in, there was no escape, not now, unless they did something desperate.